The same man who burned Bukhara issued an imperial decree, the Yasa, that guaranteed freedom of religion across the empire. Christian priests, Muslim imams, Buddhist monks, all were exempt from taxation. The Silk Road, which the Mongol conquests had devastated, was later rebuilt and protected by Mongol imperial authority with a ferocity that made it arguably safer than it had been in centuries. Travelers like Marco Polo would later describe being able to cross the entire continent under Mongol protection with a golden tablet, a paisa, that guaranteed safe passage. This contradiction, the destroyer and the administrator, the killer and the protector, lived inside the same man and the same empire simultaneously. And nowhere was that contradiction more visible than in the treatment of those who submitted versus those who resisted. The cities that surrendered quickly, often through the calculated release of refugee survivors from previous cities, spreading terror ahead of the army, were sometimes spared almost entirely. The cities that resisted were examples, and the examples were absolute. There is a story, documented in multiple Persian chronicles, though its precise details vary, of a woman in the city of Urgench who swallowed her pearl necklace rather than let Mongol soldiers take it. When the Mongol commander discovered this, he reportedly ordered every body in the city's aftermath to be open in search of swallowed valuables. Whether the story is precisely true or an exaggeration amplified by trauma and retelling, it captures something essential about the scale of dehumanization that occurs when conquest becomes systematic. And then there is the story of Genghis Khan's final campaign, the return to Western Xia in 1226 and 1227. The Tangut king had insulted the Khan by refusing to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign. It was a debt that Genghis Khan had promised himself he would collect. He was 60 or 65 years old by now. His exact birth year is uncertain, but most historians place it between 1155 and 1162. He was aging. He had survived wounds, assassinations, betrayals, and campaigns across half the planet, but he rode anyway. During the campaign, he fell from his horse. Some sources say it happened during a hunt. Others suggest he was already ill. The fall injured him severely, and his generals urged him to withdraw and recover. He refused. The Western Xia campaign continued, and it was successful, but Genghis Khan never returned home from it. In the summer of 1227, somewhere in the field, the man who had conquered the world died. The exact cause remains unknown to this day. His burial place, deliberately hidden according to Mongol tradition, has never been found. His last command, reportedly, was that the Western Xia should be annihilated after his death. His generals should tell no one he had died until the campaign was complete, and so the conquest continued even as the conqueror lay dead in secret. An empire mourning in silence, a world that did not yet know it had lost, or been released from, the man who had remade it. But one person's story remains unresolved, one thread left hanging in the wind. A Chinese princess, captured during the Jin campaigns, said by some sources to have lived in the Mongol court for years. Her name, her fate, her voice, lost entirely to history, as so many voices were. Gone, like smoke from a burning library. Gone, but not without consequence. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire he had built did not collapse. That, in itself, is one of the most extraordinary facts of the ancient world. Empires, built by singular personalities, almost always fracture at the moment of the founder's death. But Genghis Khan had understood this. He had divided his empire among his sons, Jochi's line taking the western steppes, Chagatai, the center, Ogedei, the east, Tolui, the Mongolian heartland, with Ogedei named as Great Khan. It was an imperfect arrangement, but it held long enough to change everything. Under Ogedei and his successors, the empire continued to expand. The Mongols swept through Russia, Poland, and Hungary in the 1240s, reaching the Adriatic Sea before withdrawing, not because they were defeated, but because Ogedei died and his generals returned for the Kurultai to select a new Great Khan. Western Europe, which had no capacity to resist the force that had just destroyed the Russian principalities and crushed Polish and Hungarian armies at Legnica and Mohi, was spared not by its own strength, but by Mongol dynastic politics. What nobody tells you is that the Mongol conquest ultimately accelerated the very forces that would one day bury it. The destruction of Central Asian cities initially devastated the Silk Road, but under Mongol imperial order, the so-called Pax Mongolica, trade routes were restored, postal relay systems were established, and for approximately a century, it was possible to travel from China to the Mediterranean under a single legal and military framework. Ideas, diseases, technologies, and goods moved at a speed the ancient world had never seen. Among those moving ideas was the plague. The Black Death, which devastated Europe between 1347 and 1351 and killed an estimated one-third of the European population, traveled the Silk Road routes that Mongol imperial order had made efficient. The same network that carried silk and knowledge also carried Yersinia pestis. The Mongol Empire, in a profound and terrible irony, helped give the medieval world its most catastrophic pandemic, not through intent, but through the unintended consequence of connectivity. The Mongol Empire fractured over the following century, divided by religious conversion, dynastic rivalry, and the sheer impossibility of governing 24 million square kilometers without the genius that had created it. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam. The Golden Horde in Russia remained nominally Mongol, but became deeply intertwined with Turkic and Islamic culture. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, became one of the most sophisticated administrative states of the medieval era, until it was overthrown by the Ming dynasty in 1368. What remains of the Mongol conquest today is not what most people expect. It is not primarily in ruins and graveyards, though those exist. It is in bloodlines. Genetic studies published in the early 2000s, including research by Brian Sykes and Spencer Wells, suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome lineage consistent with descent from Genghis Khan's family. It is in languages. The spread of Turkic dialects across Central Asia was accelerated by Mongol displacement of populations. It is in political geography. Borders drawn in the aftermath of Mongol conquest still define nations today, but perhaps the most enduring legacy is the one that Genghis Khan himself would have chosen. He was a man who had been abandoned, enslaved, betrayed, and left for dead, and who refused on every single occasion to accept that the world was fixed, that the powerful would always win. That birth determined destiny. He was wrong about many things. The cost of his ambition was paid in suffering beyond any easy accounting. But he was right about one thing, with a certainty that history has never been able to disprove. The world can be changed. By will, by intelligence, by the refusal to accept the limits that others have decided are permanent. A boy was born on the banks of the Onon River, clutching blood in his fist, in a world that had no place for him. He died in a field campaign 60 or so years later, still at war, still moving forward. In between those two moments, he built something that had never existed before and has never existed since, an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube. Forged not from the wealth of ancient dynasties or the resources of great civilizations, but from the loyalty of men who chose him, from the genius of a mind that never stopped learning, and from the absolute certainty that the horizon was always worth riding toward. The Mongol Empire is gone, but the world it made, the routes it opened, the borders it drew, the bloodlines it scattered, the diseases it carried, and the terror it embedded in the collective memory of half the civilizations on Earth, all of that remains. The steppes are quiet now. The grass bends in the same wind that bent it 800 years ago, somewhere beneath the earth of Mongolia, in a place that no living person knows. The greatest conqueror in human history sleeps undisturbed. And the world he remade continues, still shaped by the hand of a man who was born with nothing and left us everything we are still trying to understand. Imagine you are one of the warriors who followed Temujin after that defeat. You are cold, your horse is exhausted, and the man you bet your life on just lost. You could leave. Many did, but something about the way he talks, the way he looks at the horizon as though he can see something no one else can see. You stay, and years later, you will understand that the defeat at Dalan Baljut was the making of him. By 1206, the transformation was complete. On the banks of the Onan River, the same river where he had been born, Temujin called a great assembly, a Kurultai, of all the Mongolian tribes. They had been defeated, absorbed, converted, or annihilated. The Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father, he exterminated as a tribal entity. The Merkits were broken, the Naimans were conquered. Jamuka himself had been captured and executed, reportedly at his own request, so that no blood would be spilled. A final strange mercy between two lifelong enemies. And on that riverbank, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The meaning is disputed, but the most widely accepted translation is universal ruler. He was approximately 44 years old. He had, within his own lifetime, done what no one in the history of the steppe had ever done. He had unified the Mongols. Now he turned his eyes outward. The first great external campaign was against the Western Xia, the Tangut kingdom that sat between Mongolia and China. Beginning in 1209, Genghis Khan launched a series of campaigns that demonstrated his army's most terrifying quality, adaptability. The Mongols had no tradition of siege warfare. Steppe nomads did not besiege cities. Cities were simply outside their experience. But Genghis Khan recognized the limitation and addressed it the way he addressed every limitation. He found people who knew how to do what he didn't, and he made them teach him. Chinese engineers, Persian siege masters, captured artisans, all were absorbed into the Mongol war machine. The Mongols flooded the western Xia capital of Yinchuan by diverting a river. A plan that backfired when the dikes broke and flooded their own camp. But the Western Xia submitted anyway, offering tribute and alliance. Genghis Khan had learned. He would not make the same engineering mistake twice. Then came China, the Jin dynasty, the greatest military and economic power in East Asia. In 1211, Genghis Khan led an army estimated, and estimates vary significantly, between 60 and 100,000 cavalry, through the passes of the Gobi Desert and into northern China. The Jin had the Great Wall. They had hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They had fortified cities, war chariots, and crossbow units capable of devastating cavalry charges. What they didn't have was a way to fight an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. The Mongol approach to warfare was not a charge, it was a system. Scouts, the Naran Tumen, moved in advance to map terrain and identify weaknesses. The main force was divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with precise communication protocols using flags and fire signals. When the enemy charged, the Mongols retreated, not in panic, but in a calculated, feigned withdrawal that drew pursuing cavalry out of formation and into killing zones. Then, at the Battle of Yehuling in 1211, something decisive happened. The Jin deployed a massive force. Some Chinese sources estimate close to 500,000 men, though modern historians regard this figure as significantly inflated. What is certain is that the Jin outnumbered the Mongols substantially. What is also certain is that it didn't matter. Genghis Khan's forces used the broken terrain of the Yehu Mountains to fragment the Jin formations, then systematically destroyed them in detail. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the bodies were so numerous they formed hills across the valley floor. By 1215, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, had fallen. The Jin emperor fled south. The city burned for weeks. But even as smoke rose over the ruins of one of the world's great cities, something extraordinary was unfolding in the west. A Mongol ambassador had been murdered, and the man responsible, a man who commanded 500,000 soldiers and believed himself the most powerful ruler in the world. Mahdi. Single worst decision in the history of military miscalculation. Shah Muhammad II, Khwarezmian Empire had executed Genghis Khan's trade ambassadors. He had shaved the heads of the surviving envoys, a supreme insult in Mongol culture. and sent them back to deliver his contempt in person. It was the kind of arrogance that only a man who had never faced a real consequence could display. He was about to learn what consequence looked like. What nobody tells you is this: Genghis Khan did not want to destroy the Khwarezmian Empire. He wanted to trade with it. Multiple historical sources, including Persian chronicler Ata Malik Juvaini, confirm that he sent a second diplomatic embassy specifically to avoid war. When that embassy was also executed, the decision was made, and from that moment, the fate of Central Asia was sealed. In 1219, with an army that some historians estimate between 100 and 200,000 warriors, Genghis Khan moved west into what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. The Khwarezmian Empire, all of it, ceased to exist within 4 years. By the time the dust settled, Samarkand, the jewel of the Islamic world, had surrendered. Bukhara had burned. Urgench, which resisted, had been systematically demolished, its population divided, and its craftsmen sent east as slaves. Shah Muhammad II fled from city to city, hunted by a detachment of 20,000 Mongol warriors under generals Jabi and Subutai, a pursuit that covered thousands of miles and ended only when the Shah died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, reportedly without even a burial shroud. The Mongols had not simply won a war. They had demonstrated something that terrified every power remaining on Earth: that there was no defense, not walls, not numbers, not distance, not prayer. And yet, the most surprising reversal of all was still coming, because even as this seemingly unstoppable force rolled westward, it was not, as the legend suggests, the man behind all of it was aging, and one final campaign against a people who should have been easy prey would end in a way nobody, least of all Genghis Khan himself, expected. History remembers Genghis Khan in statistics: 40 million dead, according to some estimates, though scholars vigorously debate this figure, with many arguing the true number, while catastrophic, has been dramatically inflated by centuries of transmission. History remembers the empires destroyed, the cities burned, the dynasties erased. What history does not always remember is the texture of what ordinary human lives looked like inside those statistics. What it felt like on the ground when the world ended. The Persian scholar and administrator Nasawi, who served in the Khwarezmian court, wrote an account of the fall of Bukhara that has survived to this day. He described how Genghis Khan rode into the Friday Mosque, the holiest place in the city, and asked through a translator whether this was the palace of the Sultan. When told it was the house of God, he reportedly dismounted, climbed the pulpit, and addressed the assembled population. According to Nasawi's account, he told them that their sins had brought this punishment upon them, that he was the flail of God. Whether or not he said these exact words, Sir, and historians regard this account with appropriate caution. The image it captures is precise, the absolute certainty of a man who believed his conquests were cosmically sanctioned. Imagine you are a scholar in Bukhara. You have spent your life in one of the great libraries of the medieval world, a library that holds manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. You have copied texts by hand. You have studied under masters whose knowledge traces back centuries. In the days before the Mongols arrive, the air in the city carries smoke from distant villages already burning. You stay because you cannot imagine that civilization itself can be erased in a week. You're wrong. Within 3 days of the city's surrender, fires break out. Not from Mongol torches alone, soldiers plundering the granaries accidentally ignite them. The fire spreads. The library burns. Centuries of knowledge, gone in an afternoon. And you stand in the street watching the pages of manuscripts rise on the thermal column above the flames, black-edged and glowing, and then dissolve into ash. But here is what the history books leave out. And this matters enormously. Genghis Khan was not a simple destroyer. They had more soldiers, better weapons, more money, fortified cities, professional armies trained for generations, ancient dynasties stretching back 1,000 years, and one by one, every single one of them fell to an army that just decades earlier had no cities, no professional soldiers, no written language, and no name that anyone beyond the steppes had ever feared. The question is not how Genghis Khan conquered the world. The question is how the world ever thought it could stop him. To understand what Genghis Khan destroyed, you first have to understand what the world looked like before he arrived, and it was a world of staggering power. In the east, the Jin dynasty ruled northern China with an iron hand, a civilization of 60 million people with walls that stretched across mountain ranges, armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and centuries of military tradition. South of them, the Western Xia Kingdom, the Tangut people, sat astride the Silk Road like a toll booth at the center of the universe. To the west, the Khwarezmian Empire was, by almost any measure, the mightiest Muslim power in the world. Shah Muhammad II commanded an army historians estimate at between 400,000 and 500,000 men. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea, encompassing the great cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, cities of glass minarets, bustling markets, and scholars who had kept human knowledge alive while much of the world stumbled through darkness. And what sat between all of these empires? The steppes, an ocean of grass stretching 4,000 miles from Hungary to Manchuria. Cold in winter, burning in summer, a land without walls, without cities, without the comforts that civilization had come to depend upon. This was the world of the Mongols and their neighbors, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Carats, dozens of tribes scattered across one of the most inhospitable environments on earth. But do not mistake hardship for weakness. The people of the steppe were among the most formidable warriors the world had ever produced. They learned to ride before they learned to walk. They could fire a bow from horseback at full gallop, a skill that took years to master and that professional armies simply could not replicate. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in mobility. What they lacked in fortifications, they compensated for in ferocity. What they lacked in unity, and that, above all others, was the fatal flaw, they lacked entirely. In the late 12th century, the Mongolian steppe was not a unified force. It was a blood-soaked patchwork of feuding clans, each fighting the others for cattle, for women, for grazing land, for revenge. Alliances were made and broken in a single season. Loyalty was a commodity. Betrayal was a language everyone spoke fluently. Children were kidnapped. Leaders were poisoned. Entire clans were enslaved by their rivals. It was, in every sense of the word, a world at war with itself. And then, into this fractured, violent, magnificent chaos, a boy was born on the banks of the Onon River. According to Mongol tradition, he came into the world clutching a clot of blood in his fist. His father, Yesugei, a minor clan chief, named him Temujin, after a Tatar chieftain he had just defeated in battle. The symbolism of that name, of violence inherited at birth, would echo across every continent. No one on the steppes that night, in any jour from the Gobi to the Caspian, could have known what that child would become. No dynasty feared him, no emperor prepared for him, no prophet warned anyone that the world, the entire was about to be remade. And the man who would do the remaking, he was, at that moment, helpless, hungry, and already marked for death. What happens next is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of the human race. And it begins with a loss that should have broken him completely. Temujin was 9 years old when his father was poisoned. Yesugei had been traveling alone when Tatar tribesmen offered him food and drink, a gesture of hospitality that concealed a lethal dose of slow-acting poison. He made it home. He died within days. And just like that, the son of a minor clan chief became something the steppe had little use for, an orphan without a protector, a boy in a world that ate boys alive. What followed were years of survival so brutal they read less like biography and more like myth. Yesugei's clan, the Borjigin, abandoned his widow Hoylan and her children almost immediately. They refused to share food. They left them to fend for themselves on the open steppe. Historians believe the family survived on roots, berries, and whatever small game the children could trap. They were by every practical measure exiles in their own homeland. But here is what the history books leave out, and this is critical to understanding everything that comes after. It was during these years of abandonment, during these years of learning who would betray you and who would stand beside you, that Temujin forged the philosophy that would one day govern an empire. He learned that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned, it had to be rewarded, and it had to be absolute. That lesson, learned on an empty stomach in a freezing gyre, would one day change the architecture of human civilization. Then came the kidnapping. At 16, Temujin married Borte, the daughter of a neighboring clan chief, a political alliance as much as a personal one. But within months, raiders from the Merkit tribe descended on the camp and took her. They took her because of an old grudge. Yesuge had once stolen a Merkit woman who became Temujin's mother, Hoelun. The Merkits were collecting a debt that had been owed for nearly 2 decades. For most young men on the steppe, this was the end of the story. You lost your wife. You mourned. You moved on. But Temujin did something that nobody expected. He reached out, not with an army, because he didn't have one, but with an alliance. He called upon Togrul, the powerful Khan of the Karat tribe, a man who'd once been his father's blood brother, and he called upon Jamuka, his childhood friend, his Anda, his sworn brother by Mongol tradition. Together, they launched a rescue. The Merkit camp was overwhelmed. Bort was recovered, and in that single military action, something crystallized in Temujin. He had built, for the first time, a coalition. He had leveraged relationships. He had turned betrayal into opportunity. And he had shown to the warriors who rode with him that this young man with nothing could deliver what powerful men could not: victory. Warriors began to come to him, not because of his bloodline, not because of his wealth, but because of something rarer and more dangerous on the steppe. Because of his judgment, because following him meant winning. The tide was turning, but before Temujin could unite the Mongol clans, he would first have to survive a betrayal from the man he trusted most. And that betrayal, when it came, would nearly kill him. The road to the great Khanship was not a straight line. It was a decade of war, treachery, near death, and slow accumulation of power that reads like the most brutal kind of education imaginable. Temujin's rise unfolded in 3 distinct phases, and in each one, he did something that his enemies consistently failed to understand. He didn't just fight wars. He rewrote the rules of how wars were fought. The first phase was the elimination of rivals. In the years following Borte's rescue, Temujin's reputation drew warriors from across the steppe. He was generous with plunder, a radical departure from tradition where clan leaders hoarded spoils for themselves and their bloodlines. Temujin distributed wealth based on merit and loyalty, not birth. Slaves could become generals. Enemies who submitted and swore loyalty were welcomed. Those who betrayed him were destroyed without mercy. His oldest friendship became his greatest battlefield. Jamuka, his childhood Anda, his sworn brother, the man who had ridden beside him to rescue Borte, watched Temujin's growing power with a combination of admiration and dread. By approximately 1187, the 2 men had split. Warriors had begun choosing sides, and what had once been brotherhood became the central tension of Mongol politics for a generation. The Battle of Dalan Baljut, around 1187, was the first major test, and Temujin lost it. Jamuka defeated him decisively. What Temujin did next is extraordinary. He did not flee into permanent exile. He regrouped, he absorbed the lesson. He studied what Jamuka had done and began to systematically dismantle it. Because here is what nobody tells you about Genghis Khan's military genius. It was not innate. It was learned. It was stolen, piece by piece, from every man who ever beat him.